Welcome to the Smart Business Revolution.
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 You want a revolution?
You say you want a revolution?
Revolution. The revolution.
It's going on right now.
Welcome to The Revolution, the Smart Business Revolution podcast, where we ask today's most successful entrepreneurs to share the tools and strategies they use to build relationships and connections to grow their revenue. Now, your host for The Revolution, John Corcoran.
All right, welcome everyone. John Corcoran here, excited for this live episode with
Dr. Jeremy Weisz here with InspiredInsider.com. I guess this will be on your podcast and my podcast.
That's right, on Smart Business Revolution and on Inspired Insider. And I'm excited because every week I get to talk to smart CEOs. I've talked to recently the co-founder and original CEO of Netflix, people from Activation Blizzard, LendingTree, OpenTable, you name it, but no smarter than my business partner, Dr. Jeremy Weisz, who I get to talk to today on a very discreet, very distinct, but very important concept when it comes to content marketing, and especially in the podcast world, which is season versus series. Season versus series. Very trendy in the podcasting world these days to do podcast seasons. Is that the right approach? We're going to talk about that here. But first, before we get into that, this episode is brought to you by Rise25 Media, where we help B2B businesses to get clients, referrals, and strategic partnerships with done-for-you podcasts and content marketing. I've been doing a podcast personally for about 10, 11 years now. Jeremy for at least that long or longer, and been advising. Jeremy, you've been advising podcasters and companies and starting podcasts since 2008 or 2009 or something like that. I think back before the iPod was invented. He's been doing it before there even was a podcast. He was advising people on it. So he is as seasoned a hand as there is in this field. And if you have any questions about starting a podcast and using it as a tool for business development, referral marketing, strategic partnerships, content, and all the 100 different ways that you can use it, email us at support@rise25media.com or connect with us at rise25media.com. All right, so Dr. Weisz, I'm excited to talk to you about this. Seasons versus series. Okay, we hear it all the time. People say, I'm doing a season of a podcast. First of all, what does that mean when people talk about it?
I was going to ask you, what do you think I have an idea of what I think it means. What do you think when someone says, why would someone do a season?
Honestly, I think the reason people do a season is it's a holdover from a former way of communicating in the media. We think of like Friends, Seinfeld, they all came in seasons, right? And so people just used to do it that way, and they think that that is the professional way of doing it. I think that's why people continue to do it.
I also think it depends on the type of show. Like if it's I listen to mostly nonfiction or business related podcasts. And so I think if you are what's a popular non-business related, like entertainment one?
Yeah, there's true crime is a very popular,
true crime,
and there's seasons where they follow a particular crime and they go through it, and those are great. That's mostly not what we're talking about here. In those cases, a season makes sense. But when you're talking about the context that the field we play in, which is primarily B2B businesses that are creating podcasts for a variety of purposes, including business development, including content, including professional networking, all those different reasons, it starts to make less sense. Yeah,
I want to differentiate that because I think in like a true crime, like a season makes perfect sense, right? And what would be the difference between the season and the series? We have our own definition of that, I guess you could say. But I feel like also people do a season in their podcast because they want to take a break. And so they're like, cool, I'm going to do season 1 and then just wait for season 2. But in our opinion, if you are a business, we think all businesses should have a podcast. It's like it will become table stakes, just like every business has a website. Every business should have a podcast, and it's an amazing way to give to your network of people and to also share your expertise. But we're always looking at ways to give to our network of people.
Yeah.
And when you think of in a business, I think, so moving from a season, we prefer to recommend for us and our clients to do a series, and a series is an ongoing sessions. And let's say we're talking to someone and they're like, you know what, because we it's funny, we have people come to us, John, people say, I want to start a second podcast. I'm like, okay, convince me why you should start a second podcast. And by the way, for this individual, if we do a second podcast, that means we are running their second podcast, which means more revenue. But I oftentimes try and talk them out of doing a second podcast most of the time.
Why?
And here's why. And there's a couple outlier instances where I do, I do agree with them. Like, great, start a second podcast. But the person's like, well, I'm really focused on, top, maybe CFOs and the contents around CFOs. And we love featuring the top CFOs. But, and it may be even more specific, like CFOs and SaaS companies. And really, I want to shift to getting more content and the leaders in CMO world in e-commerce. Like, I should start a separate podcast, or I should do a season of this, stop it, and then do a season of that. And I would say my advice is no, don't do a second podcast in that situation. Do it on the same podcast, and you can basically just do it as a series it runs concurrently. So you could do both of them at the same time. You don't have to do 10 episodes on this and then do 10 episodes on that. That kind of stops the momentum, and you can have both of them going at the same time. And you can, when the CFOs release, you release those episodes. And when the CMOs come out, you release those episodes. And it allows you to, not necessarily have to pigeonhole yourself or only restrict your efforts in one direction. If you want to do two and just release them when they come out, you can do that. And, you could very easily segment them on your website, basically saying, this is part of my CMO series and this is part of my CFO e-commerce series. If that makes sense.
Another point I make to people is that when you confine yourself to this limit of like 10 episodes in a season, and you announce it at the beginning, there's going to be 10 episodes, right? And then on your 10th episode, you ask, as we encourage people to do, you ask the guests that you had on, hey, is there anyone else that in your network that you think would be a good person that I should interview? And they tell you the names of 5 people. If you've been doing 10 all along and that's the end of the season, then you have to say like, oh, sorry, I'm done with this. And you completely missed out on the whole purpose, or one of the big purposes, and one of the big reasons, one of the big advantages of doing a podcast, which is networking and getting introductions to other great people. So having this artificial limitation of 10 episodes or 20 episodes or whatever, it ends up really harming you. And then you also mentioned at the beginning, you said part of the reason that people do a season is they want to take a break. They want to take a break. And I think I want to dig a little deeper into that, because I think the problem is the season isn't the answer. The problem is that the way that they're doing the podcast is too much work on them. They probably have too much on their shoulders, too much on their plate. They haven't offloaded pieces. And I know this pain very acutely because you helped me with it 5 or 6 years ago when I was ready to give up my podcast. And I had too much on my plate. I was not delegating enough of it, and I wasn't focusing my energies on the right thing. So I think if the reason that they're doing a season is because they want to be able to take a break, what they need to do is improve their process so that the elements that they focus on with the podcast, they love, they enjoy, they can delegate all the rest, or hire a team like ourselves where we can handle all those pieces for them so they can focus on the highest and best use of their time, connect with great people, deepen relationships with existing champions and clients, get more clients, and then they'll be motivated to keep going. The other thing I'll say that, just dovetailing on what you said, was when you do 2 shows, it's additional complexity. If you add another show, it's additional complexity. Rather than keeping it as one show, doing different series that are combined in one show, you achieve the same objectives that you wanted to achieve without the additional complexity of doing 2 shows. And just, I'm sure you've seen this, Jeremy, I've seen this over 10, 11, 12 years of doing a podcast. We've seen a lot of people that come into the space, they add 1, 2 shows, they do it for 6 months or 12 months, and then maybe they do each halfway and they get frustrated and then they end up quitting both. Whereas others who come into the space, do 1 show, have enough content and energy and time to devote to doing that 1 show well, and then they end up doing it more successfully. So it just ends up being more successful, and you get the long-term benefit of doing it without giving up, which is really what we're about. We're really about getting people to the long-term benefit, which is why you and I continue to do it over all these years, is because of the long-term benefit to it.
Yeah, I think like what you said with, the 2 most important pieces that we find that people are most successful is they delegate all the pieces. So they're worried about just building the relationship and running their business. And the second is having the right strategy in place to make sure it makes sense in serving the goals of the business. And so they could be doing all this activity, but is it leading to the goals that they have set? So the right strategy is paramount. And we want to make sure that people have the right strategy for their business. The second thing I'll mention is, when someone does a season, they may have different goals, and their goals may change, or their goals or strategy may shift. I remember when I first started my podcast a long time ago, I thought I was going to be the number 1 podcast for productivity. I love productivity. I was going to have every single, productivity founder. My questions would be about productivity. I'd have the top CEOs, founders. And after about 4 episodes, I was like, this is like, what am I thinking? They keep saying the same thing. I don't want to ask these questions anymore. And so if I would have said, like, I'm going to do a season of 12, I'm going to do this or productivity. I didn't name my show the Productivity Show or anything. I didn't pigeonhole it, luckily, but I could have. So what you think you start with, or even right now, it may shift. So you just have to be careful on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and the other thing I will point out is that we often say to people that the way we do things, the name of the show doesn't matter so much, because a series in some ways can substitute for the same purpose of a name does, which is ultimately when you're doing a podcast, it's about getting great people to have great conversations with you. And so a piece of that is communicating in text, LinkedIn, email message, or, in person, and communicating to people about the wisdom and the virtue of them spending 30 minutes talking to you so that you can create a podcast episode together. And especially when you're getting started, this is important because you don't have a large track record. But this series, if you do it right, you reach out, you use the right language, you communicate, say, I'm doing a series on my podcast featuring top CEOs in the tri-state area or something like that. You communicate it the right way. One, it doesn't matter what the name of the podcast is, and it serves a similar purpose to what a season does without the confinement, without the handcuffs that you get of a limited season. And it allows you to come back to it, as you mentioned earlier, comes back to it from time again. So you've done a lot on your podcast where you do a series where you might do a couple of episodes, then you go and do other episodes on another topic, and then you come back again. But it gives you the benefit. And then eventually you get a couple of great people in that series, and then all you have to do is name drop a couple of other people as part of that series, and people's competitive juices start flowing, and they're thinking like, I'm the top CFO in the tri-state area. I want to be part of this. You include, I know that person. I want to be part of that, and so it achieves that result as well. Any final thoughts, Jeremy, on this?
I think you hit on something important, which is it's basically a way to niche without niching, if that makes any sense, right? Because you don't have to call your show the CMO e-commerce show or something.
Yeah.
And then
next month you decide that you're not going to focus on CMOs, or you're not going to focus on e-commerce or whatever. Yeah.
It is interesting how it spirals and leads and like even so I have interviewed over 100 of the top direct response marketers, copywriters on the planet. I've gone down the route and having some of the top e-commerce people, whether they're running their own company or maybe they're a software in the space. I went and have done top VCs, venture capitalists. So I've gone across these different niches, and it just accumulates over time. As someone reached out the other day and was like, "Oh, I think I have some VCs to introduce you to, and who else have you interviewed?" And I basically, as I looked through my episodes, I started listing them, and I'm like, "Oh my God, I've actually interviewed a ton of VCs." And when I listed it out, and now if I would have just done a season that I did started 6 months ago, I would be like, I'm sorry, I'm not doing that right now.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So that's a great advantage. All right, Jeremy, where can people go learn more about you, learn more about the work that we do at Rise25?
You can go to, I think a better title for this instead of series versus season should be, how do you niche without niching?
That is a great, yes.
But you can go to rise25.com. You can go to our about page. If you go to the homepage, John and I are bantering a bit, and I think he included some outtakes on our thoughts on how do you get ROI with a podcast. You can check out rise25.com or about page, or more episodes of Smart Business Revolution, more episodes of Inspired Insider, because we have tons and tons and tons of free content of some of the, I consider some of the most amazing founders, entrepreneurs, executives on the planet.
And go connect with us on LinkedIn. We do these LinkedIn live every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Central Time, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. It's a pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Smart Business Revolution podcast with John Corcoran. Find out more at smartbusinessrevolution.com. And while you're there, sign up for our email list and join the revolution.
Revolution.
And be listening for the next episode of the Smart Business Revolution podcast.